For 6 centuries, one empire fought war after war against kings, sultans, republics, crusaders, rebels, and rising European powers. They conquered nations, lost nations, rebuilt borders, survived crises, and kept an army marching from the Balkans to the Arabian desert. And through it all, they did something almost no other empire in history managed to pull off. They didn't go bankrupt doing it. Because the Ottoman Empire didn't just fight war, they found a way to finance war, endlessly. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Ottoman Empire lasted from around 1299 to 1922, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the British Empire, longer than almost any state the modern world usually talks about. But longevity is not the most interesting part. The mystery is how an empire that fought almost constantly didn't collapse under the financial pressure. Western viewers often imagine that empires fall because they lose battles, but battles don't bankrupt nations. Budgets do, leaders do, logistics do. The Ottoman Empire learned this early, and instead of building a conventional tax and army system like Europe's kingdoms, they built something far more efficient, a machine where war could pay for itself. But before we get into the mechanisms, we need to establish what the Ottomans actually were, because for many Western audiences, the empire is a vague idea: turbans, sultans, domes, and Janissaries. The cinematic images are familiar, but the centuries-long engine behind them is not. So let's slow down, step in, and set the stage. The Ottomans began as a small frontier principality in northwest Anatolia, led by Osman the Muir, a warlord with a few thousand riders and a talent for being in the right place at the right time. When the Byzantine Empire began to crumble and Mongol power receded from the Near East, Osman's followers were perfectly positioned to carve out new territory. Their early victories weren't just military successes, they were financial windfalls, because every conquest meant land, resources, crops, taxes, and new populations to extract revenue from. And that's the first key to understanding the Ottoman financial system. From day one, warfare wasn't a cost, it was an income stream. By the time the Ottomans captured Bursa in 1326 and later crossed into Europe in the 1350s, they were no longer a frontier tribe. They were the rising power controlling the trade routes between Europe and Asia, which, in medieval economics, is like having a monopoly on the world's arteries. Every merchant who traveled from Venice to Persia, from Cairo to Budapest, from Baghdad to Istanbul, passed through the Ottoman toll gate. This mattered because war requires 3 things: food, metal, and men. The Ottomans didn't necessarily have more of any of these than their neighbors, but they had something even more important: cash flow. Their empire was built on the richest crossroads of the pre-modern world: silk, spices, carpets, horses, weapons, timber, sugar, copper. Everything moved through their territory. And every time something moved, the Ottomans taxed it. But a strong revenue base alone doesn't explain how the empire paid for centuries of campaigns, stretching from Vienna's walls to Yemen's mountains, because almost every empire in history has had revenue, and most still collapsed under military costs. What made the Ottomans different was structural. They designed a financial system that turned the army into a self-financing institution. This is where the story shifts from geography to design, to one of the most important and misunderstood innovations in Ottoman history, the Timar system. Imagine a government trying to avoid the biggest cost of all: payroll. Modern states spend fortunes on professional soldiers, salaries, equipment, horses, pensions. Militaries drain budgets. The Ottomans solved this problem by refusing to pay soldiers in cash. Instead, they paid them in rights. A timar was essentially a tax district. A soldier, usually a cavalryman called a sipahi, received the right to collect taxes from a specific village or region. In exchange, he was obligated to equip himself, maintain his horse, and show up for campaigns with proper armor and weapons. He didn't receive a salary, he funded himself. It was one of the most ingenious pieces of financial engineering in world history. The state reduced its expenses. The soldier became invested in local stability because stable villages meant stable taxes. The peasants lived their lives under a predictable local authority. And the empire had an army that could mobilize quickly without emptying the treasury. Imagine if today's government paid a soldier not with money, but with the right to collect taxes from a county. If that sounds dangerous, you're right. But in the 1300s and 1400s, it worked spectacularly well. It turned the Ottoman army into a tax-powered military machine. And it did something even more important. It meant that Ottoman warfare was cheap. Europe at the time relied on expensive knights or mercenaries who demanded payment up front. If a king ran out of money, his army ran out of loyalty. The Ottomans didn't have that problem. Their soldiers' funding flowed even during peacetime. The war didn't strain the budget, it activated the system. But the Timar system wasn't the only mechanism that allowed the Ottomans to fund 6 centuries of conflict. They had another innovation, one that Western audiences often know by name but rarely understand fully: the Janissaries. and their funding model was a core part of the Ottoman financial engine. But that story requires a shift from cavalry funded by taxes to infantry funded by something far more controversial. To understand the second piece of the Ottoman war financing engine, we need to look at the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that foreigners feared, Christians resented, and sultans trusted more than their own families. They were professional soldiers, disciplined, trained from youth, and loyal to the state alone. In European terms, they were the closest thing the Middle Ages had to Marines. But what made them financially unique was how the empire acquired and funded them. The Janissaries came from the devshirme, often called the child levy. In Christian villages across the Balkans, boys were selected, removed from their homes, converted to Islam, and educated in the empire's military schools. They were trained, indoctrinated, and molded into a class of soldiers who owed everything to the state. Not to tribes, not to landlords, not to regions. Now, the ethics of this system are not the point here. It was harsh and coercive, and we shouldn't romanticize it. But financially, it accomplished something no other empire managed. The state acquired elite soldiers without paying the high upfront cost of raising, training, and equipping men from birth. The empire did invest heavily in Janissary education, but the initial economic burden of raising children to adulthood was effectively outsourced to conquered populations. This meant the Ottoman Empire obtained fully formed soldiers without the lifetime expenses that would bankrupt a treasury. And once these soldiers entered service, they were paid and housed. But they were also prohibited from marrying or owning businesses in their early centuries, which prevented conflicts of interest and kept the state in control. If the Tamar system turned the cavalry into a self-financing force, the Janissaries turned the infantry into a highly efficient, low-cost professional corps. Combined, they formed a military system that saved the empire untold amounts of money over the centuries. But the Ottomans didn't stop there. They perfected something even more powerful, ensuring that war paid for war. Whenever the empire conquered new territory, it didn't just gain land, it gained new taxpayers, new Timars, new trade routes, new ports, and new revenue streams. Every conquest strengthened the financial foundation of the next campaign. A European kingdom might win a war and come home poorer. The Ottomans often came home richer. This is the heart of their long-term survival strategy. Not strategy, not luck. Cash flow. Consider the geography. The Ottoman Empire straddled the Bosporus, the Dardanelles, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the caravan routes to Persia and Central Asia. If you wanted to move goods from Europe to Asia or vice versa, you paid the Ottomans. Silk from China, spices from India, carpets from Persia, you paid the Ottomans. Venetian merchants, Arab traders, Balkan caravans, North African fleets, they all passed through the empire's toll booth. This system worked so well that by the 1500s, the empire had become one of the wealthiest states on earth. War was expensive, but trade was more profitable, and the empire built financial systems to tap into that profit directly. One was state monopolies. Certain commodities, salt, tobacco, coffee, sometimes soap, were controlled directly by the state. These goods were essential for daily life, which meant the money flowed predictably into the treasury. This is where the story starts sounding eerily modern, because state monopolies are the ancestors of today's strategic national industries. Think oil in Saudi Arabia, think gas pipelines in Russia, think the Suez Canal in Egypt. Every empire has a revenue anchor. For the Ottomans, these monopolies were the closest thing they had to a perpetual income machine. Another financial strategy was the use of tribute and vassal states. Many regions, from Crimea to Wallachia, paid annual sums to the Ottoman treasury in exchange for protection or autonomy. It was cheaper to accept tribute than to govern directly, and the income funded soldiers, roads, fortresses, and fleets. But the real brilliance, and eventual weakness, of the Ottoman financial system was how it delayed the need for borrowing. For centuries, the empire lived within its means. War was financed by land grants, trade tolls, tribute, plunder, and monopolies. There was no national debt spiral, no giant bond market draining the treasury, no foreign lenders deciding the empire's fate. That didn't last forever. By the late 1600s and 1700s, the world changed. European powers industrialized. Their armies adopted new technologies. Their trade networks shifted across the oceans, not through the Ottoman land routes. Suddenly, the empire could no longer rely on caravans and tolls to finance its military. Worse, the Timar system began decaying. Local tax holders abused their power, centralized oversight weakened, and soldiers became less reliable. Then came the Janissaries. Over the centuries, they gained political influence, wealth, and privileges until they became a state within a state. Their financial independence and political clout made them impossible to control. They resisted reforms, drained the treasury, and eventually became one of the biggest obstacles to modernization. When the empire finally began adopting European-style armies, they needed something they had avoided for centuries: cash salaries. And to fund that, they turned to something even more dangerous: foreign loans. In the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire began borrowing heavily from European banks at high interest rates. The same European powers it once outplayed now controlled its finances. Debt spiraled. Payments fell behind. In 1881, the empire was forced to hand control of its finances to an international commission run by France and Britain, a humiliating end to centuries of financial independence. It's a familiar pattern, isn't it? A great power rises on financial discipline, holds itself together with innovative systems, ignores early warning signs, and collapses when the economics stop working. Which brings us to today. If you think the Ottoman system sounds ancient, look around. The same mechanisms still exist, just wearing modern clothes. The old Timar system functions today as government contracts and privatized military logistics. Modern states outsource enormous parts of their military operations to private companies, reducing direct payroll burdens the same way the Ottomans once did. Trade tolls have become the modern struggle for control over shipping lanes and energy routes. From the Strait of Hormuz to the South China Sea, whoever controls a choke point controls the revenue that passes through it. State monopolies live on through national oil companies and sovereign wealth funds. Saudi Aramco plays the same role the Ottoman salt monopoly once did, just on a scale of trillions instead of millions. Conquest paying for conquest still exists in the form of resource-driven wars. Countries pursue territory or influence not for glory, but for energy reserves, minerals, pipelines, and strategic geography. And late borrowing, the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, echoes today in modern national debt crises. Many states fund their deficits with loans until the system cracks. Argentina, Greece, and even the modern U.S. debt debate. The financial logic of empire doesn't change. The uniforms do. So what is the lesson? Empires don't die on the battlefield. They die on the balance sheet. The Ottomans survived 6 centuries because their financial system was disciplined, efficient, and brilliantly designed to turn war into revenue. They collapsed when that system broke. And when expansion stopped paying for itself, when trade routes bypassed their territory, when soldiers became expensive, and when the empire borrowed so much money that foreign creditors owned its future. And that's the deeper warning beneath their story. Financial systems can sustain power for centuries until the day they can't. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.